Hey guys, I wanted to come to you today and share a video of me going through a process of learning to work with watercolor. I have always usually come from a place where I am more experienced with the medium that I'm working with, but recently I think it's kind of dawned on me that I really want to share a little bit more about or document the learning process. And this took a little bit of a leap for me because it is not very comfortable to film yourself doing something you don't necessarily, have a lot of experience with. But on the flip side of that, I think it's really important to show that to be an artist and to really embrace all the beauty that art can give us, we have to humble ourselves and remember what it's like to be a beginner. So I have been recently working with watercolors. I'm very new to watercolors, and they're such a different medium. I'm used to working with oils or acrylics, and so when I started working with watercolors, I found myself wanting to exert my experience onto these watercolors. I wanted them to do what I wanted them to do in my mind, and what I wasn't realizing is that I needed to instead of overly control, I needed to kind of surrender to the learning process and observe what the watercolors were capable of, what happens when I add water here, what happens if I don't add water here. I had to experiment and explore and fail and make a mess so that I could learn the language of this new medium for me. And so that's why I'm sharing this video, because I want to show that other side of, yes, I'm an experienced artist in certain ways, but I also don't know a lot of things. And I want to keep not knowing a lot of things because I really believe that learning is for life, and that the art journey doesn't just end once you're really good at something. It might for some people, but for me, I want to keep learning. I want to keep growing. I want to keep exploring different mediums. And so this is the experience that I wanted to share with you. So if you see me fumbling around and making mistakes, if you're an experienced watercolor artist, you might even cringe. Bear with me. I'm learning, and I think we're all learning. So I hope you guys enjoy this, and thank you so much for watching. Okay guys, so here I am, and I've got my watercolor paper. This is a cold press watercolor paper, 150 grams, no, 150 pounds. And I am drawing this portrait with my non-dominant hand. I like to do that a lot because it really helps me loosen up. It helps me to just get in the flow with things, and it just takes away that inner critic voice that often kind of gets me a little bit hung up. So I love using my non-dominant hand, and I often find, surprisingly, that I get a more accurate, kind of more expressive sketch going. So I highly recommend exploring drawing with your non-dominant hand and see what happens. And it does take a little while to kind of surrender to the awkwardness of it because it does feel really weird. But here I am trying to be a beginner here with my watercolor exploration, and so I just felt like it was really natural for me to just start in this way, really open-minded, open-hearted, to just kind of surrender to the process and not overly think or overly criticize the beginning stages. I know that I can do that a lot, and I'm sure you guys can relate sometimes. So yeah, I'm just going for it. I'm just using a real light pencil here. I believe it was an HB pencil, nothing fancy. I grabbed it off my shelf and just got started. I like to play music when I do this as well. It helps me not think, and it just allows me to flow with my reference image and kind of just get things moving. Now I switch over to my dominant hand and start to add in a little bit more structure to the face. And I love that I already have kind of a blueprint down. I already have the structure. This is just adding in a little bit more form, maybe a little bit more tone, and I can just start to build the structures of the face. And this is an intuitive muse. You don't have to make your watercolor muse realistic at all. You'll see in the end, she really isn't realistic. I use the reference image very loosely. And then I'm taking a big mop brush and just loading it up with water. And I'm gonna start wetting some areas. And this is where, I'm new at watercolor, so I'm kind of figuring out where do I want to wet things first and allow the colors to pool, and where do I not want to do it. So I am using here a couple of blues, and I'll list all the colors in the materials, but I'm using a couple different blues here. I believe it was an ultramarine and a cobalt, I believe. And I'm starting to add in some of the shadow. I know that the shadows, I know where they are based on my reference image, so I can go ahead and sort of start to carve those out. And I know that I can go back and refine things. So I'm trying not to get too freaked out. And I'm doing the same here on the other side, under the nose. Anywhere where shadow is going to fall, I figure I may as well go with this deeper blue tone, because obviously shadows tend to be cooler and darker. And that is one of the tricky things about watercolors. You have to think about where you want to leave light. And I'm not used to that with acrylic and with oils. You can always build up those layers. So this was a little challenging for me, actually. And I know you can't, see, what my face is doing right now, but trust me, there was a part of me that was kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm making a huge mess and this isn't going to work, and what am I doing? Yeah. So I'm just trying to loosen up and flow with it, let it kind of do its thing. I love drips, so I go ahead and pick up my my board there and just allow the water to flow and just see what that does. So here I'm just playing with dropping in color. I'd seen a lot of different YouTube videos and watching some of the watercolor artists do this, where they drop color into the wet pools. And again, I am new at this process, so I'm really just playing. It's always fun to add some speckles, I think, into my work. So I'm doing a little bit of that. Adding in some of those unexpected things that you can't really plan. And I love that about drips and speckles, because you can't really preordain how they're gonna be. And I love those little surprises. Dropping in a little bit more blue and just sort of getting a variety of shades so that I can have more to work with. You'll see that I'm working in a primary color palette. I've got a couple blues, a kind of a cadmium red, and a yellow. And I know that can make some mud, as you see here, but I'm okay with having some grayer parts in the shadows especially. So I'm not too worried about that. So now I'm starting to move into a little bit more of a warmer shadow color, and it's kind of making like a grayish red color, and putting that into the hair, smooshing that around literally, trying not to panic and just seeing what happens. And of course with watercolor, I've noticed that it changes so much as it dries. You really have to wait until it dries to really see what your results are. So it's obviously a very fluid process, pun intended. Here I'm trying to lift areas and soften edges. I've noticed that if I can go back in, take a little water off my brush, I can go back into some of the puddlier areas and kind of soften the edges so I don't get a hard edge. I'm still learning how to perfect that. And I haven't changed brushes. I'm still using that big brush, and I will give you the details of that brush down below in the supply list. Now I'm just kind of getting a little looser. I can feel myself sort of loosening up, making a few more marks that are a little bit more random. I'm just kind of playing with even this sort of slightly leaf-shaped look here with the blue, and just building in some elements of pattern in a way that I'll be able to hopefully play with, you know, as we go. But not trying to overly control it too much. Really just playing at this point, really just exploring what happens when I move my brush this way, what happens when I move my brush this, you know, another way, and just seeing what results I'm getting. And you know, this is a challenge to stay open and respond instead of control. That's a real challenge for me. Here I'm adding in some more definition, little touches of blue to add a little more contrast in those areas around the eye. You know, I know that there's shadow under the nose. I know there's shadow, you know, in the crease of the eyelids, things like that. So I know I can add those in. I'm pretty familiar with the structure of the face, so I have that. I still do have my reference photo off camera as well to guide me if I lose the form. I'm still getting some of those cauliflower edges. I'm still learning about how to reduce that in my work, where you add paint into an area that's already started to dry and there's more water on your brush, and you end up getting those kind of cauliflower edges that look kind of like a bleeding puddle. They're not always a bad thing. I've been told that you want to avoid them, but at this stage I'm just kind of trying to do my best. I'm not worried too much that I have some of those effects in there. And my goal here was to, you know, I call it the watercolor muse, but it was the idea of sitting down and, you know, without a lot of planning, grabbing a reference picture, using my non-dominant hand and starting to just create, and not really knowing what it's going to look like in the end at all. You know, you'll see here I'm switched to a smaller brush, and I'm seeing what that feels like. I'm playing with some more, you know, linear marks, as well as more of those leaves. And once I actually surrendered to this process, I found it actually very relaxing, and it was fun. I was very hesitant. I was really nervous. But then, you know, once you kind of get over yourself and realize it's just paper, it's just paint, and if it's a big mess, who cares? I can, you know, scrap the recording, not share it, and try again another time. So I'm really trying to be more kind to myself as I'm learning. You know, really watching that inner talk and giving myself some grace. I'm kind of hooked on these leaves that I'm starting to create. They're quite fun. You see them in a lot of my work, so I felt like it was fun to kind of incorporate them here. And I think the tricky thing about watercolor is that, you know, you don't use a bunch of different layers like you would with, you know, oil and acrylic. I mean, you do build up layers, but you can't necessarily paint over with any kind of opaque, you know, you can't necessarily correct an area that well, or at least I'm not familiar with how to correct certain aspects with the watercolor yet. So I felt that was kind of the scary part, I think, for me. I just had to see what happens, and that was tricky. So I'm loving adding this red in here. It's kind of a fun contrast with the blue, and it's adding sort of a vibrancy to the piece that wasn't there before. Of course, when I first made the red marks, I thought, oh no, I've just completely ruined it. But I just decided to keep pushing through and just to work with it. And I ended up really enjoying the other colors that I bring in, and you'll see it kind of comes together over time. But I thought it added more richness to the piece. I love monochromatic work, but I was pushing myself to use more than one color here. And I really think that it's about, and I mentioned this in the intro, it's kind of is about starting to surrender to the process of learning, realize that you don't know what you're doing, and kind of be okay with that and be like, you know what, I have to start somewhere. I have to try things, and I won't know anything unless I try some different things. I won't know what works, and I won't know what doesn't work. I really believe that our quote-unquote mistakes are just as important as our triumphs, because they inform us about the process, about how we work with the process, which is different than how anyone else works with it. And I think that can be really a beautiful thing to accept and embrace as we're learning something new. Not always easy to embrace, but important. So I'm getting a little bit more confident. I can kind of tell by the way I'm putting the paint on, a little bit less hesitant, and really kind of going for it now, which is fun. So I'm bringing in the yellow now and starting to splash that around to see what happens. And you can see I do move my colors around. I do that with a lot of my work just to kind of create more color harmony, color cohesion. So I encourage that. You don't, necessarily want just yellow in one part. Maybe you want to move the yellow around. I go ahead and grab my pencil here and start making line work, because again, that's something that I love in my work. And I think that's what also starts to happen as you surrender in, is that you start to discover the way that you want to work with the medium. You start to learn the language of the medium and how it speaks to you and how you want to communicate with it. So it becomes sort of an exchange, even an energetic sort of exchange with the paint. You start co-creating with your materials, and you realize that you're not necessarily the one that has to be so in charge. I think you can be informed by your materials. They can give you a lot of information. And I know that might sound a little strange, but I think once we start really being in more of a conversation with the creation, rather than ordering it around, bossing it around, trying to get it to do something that you see in your mind, rather than that, when we start to really, like I mentioned before, respond to the material, respond to the experience. And in this case, you're working with water. You're working with the element of water, so you have to stay fluid, you have to stay open. It encourages you to do that. The minute you start to get restrictive, you're going to get frustrated. So here I'm going in with more layers, adding a little bit more intensity of color. I've got my little brush here. I'm trying to drag my brush through it and maybe make some more linear marks. Because again, I'm pulling those aspects, those mark-making elements from how I usually work with charcoal or oils or acrylics or whatever. So I start to pull in some of the familiar things that I enjoy about my own style. And guys, I binge watched watercolor videos on YouTube before I decided to do this. And I learned so much. This was so amazing about the online community, is there's so much to learn. Of course, we have classes that we have on our platform that I take the classes sometimes. I just recently took Stephanie Ryan's class, which was fantastic, a beautiful watercolor class. We've got some great teachers that we can learn from in our community, which I'm so grateful for. So at this stage, there are elements here that I really like. Like I really like the lips right now. I like certain aspects around the eyes. And then there's elements I'm not that keen on. It's pretty dry at this stage, so I just decided to kind of go for it and just keep building, going back to the structure of the face and seeing what I can do with that. Emphasizing that cheekbone, the shadow. You know, I've got a lot of colors, I've got a lot of, watery sort of layering happening. So I figure let's go back and redefine some things here. And you can see it's kind of, it was all kind of free form, like let's play around with color, let's drop in some mark making and some fun, elements, and then it's like, okay, let's go back and edit a little bit, let's refine. And that's typical of the way that I work with, my creations. I tend to kind of like let loose and then have a moment of reflection where I kind of look at it, ponder what's working, what's not, where do I need more structure, where do I need more contrast. So I am doing that same process here with the watercolors as well. I didn't necessarily plan it that way, but it just sort of, you get to a stage in the painting where it kind of invites you to take a step back and evaluate. And I know I want there to be some structure in the face. I want there to be some sense of form. So it was important to me to capture that. And honestly, guys, like after I did this face, I feel like I did a bunch more because I was so hooked on how this felt. And I'm going to keep doing these watercolor faces, I think, because it was just so relaxing and fun, and it was unexpected things that happen with the water that is so different than working with my typical opaque paints. So here I'm going in with my small brush and I'm making small marks. How can I bring in some more delicate elements? And again, I do this with my typical paintings as well. I go from making large, swaths of color with a large brush, then I might move to a medium brush, and then I'll go in with a pen or pencil, a small brush, and add finer details. And I think that this layering can bring a lot more complexity to the piece and just some more visual interest. And it allows the viewer to kind of spend a little bit more time sort of enjoying or investigating the piece. I think our eye likes those little details where we can kind of have a little look. And I love that, depending on the size of brush you use, you get different size speckles. So try doing your speckles with different size brushes, so you get different size speckles, which is fun. So now I'm doing the same thing, but with the blue. Just kind of echoing those shapes and those marks around the face. Okay, so I have jumped into I'm using a watercolor pencil, and I'm going in, I think that was the Prussian blue, but I will have all the information at the bottom for you guys. So I'm starting to sketch out, some of the more details of the eyelid, the eyebrow. I'm going in and just lightly shading some of those areas and just bringing a little bit more structure and a little bit more detail. And now, I think, yes, I go in with my Posca pen, which is a big favorite of mine, and I'm adding in the light. Lately I've been really into doing these eyes where there's like, it's very subtle contrast in the actual eye. So it's more about the highlight and then the shadows, but I'm not like doing super defined irises and pupils lately. So you'll see here that I do define it a little more than this, but I kind of like the effect of it. I think it's kind of got like a soft, dreamy effect. But I do love, of course, the highlights. That's like my favorite, as you guys probably know. I love to add in that reflection in the tear line or the water line up on the eyelids. And, you know, always remember that your reflections and your shadows really inform the viewer of where the eyes are looking. So you can see here she's kind of looking off to the left because that's where we see the highlight, right? That's the highest point of the eye. So that's where you're going to see the highlight. And of course, right next to a highlight is going to be a darker dark, which would be the pupil. So I'm starting to kind of build a little bit more contrast in the eye, but I don't want to overdo it. Like I said, I don't want to really delineate the pupil and the iris. It's just something I've been doing lately. I kind of enjoy the way it looks. And I'm then adding a little bit of shading into the lips to define the corners of the lips. Typically have some shadow, of course, where the lips meet have shadow. And just going in here and refining those features. And you did also see me use the brush on the watercolor pencil, and you can, you know, activate the watercolor pencil. Here I'm using a little bit of white gouache. So I went in with the Posca pen, and that was good, but I wanted to push it a little more and use my tiny little brush with some white gouache. You could use white acrylic paint too if you don't have gouache, or you could stick with your paint pen or like a white gel pen to add in the highlights too. So you can see I add a little bit of shadow around the highlights in the eyes, and that's kind of all that I do to indicate where the iris and pupil are. A little bit of highlight on the lip and on the nose. And I've got another watercolor pencil. I'm going in a little darker. I'm pushing the darks here in the eyes, adding in a couple flicks to represent the eyelashes. I think this was like a raw umber or a Van Dyke brown pencil there. And I'm just going to continue shading that top lip. Of course, the top lip is typically in shadow. And just defining that neck area a little bit more. So it's kind of this balance between structure and then things just kind of floating away into watery pools. I wanted that contrast. Of course, you guys, if you look at my work, you will know I love doing little white dots. So I couldn't resist. And I am in full play mode now. I'm having a good time here. I've kind of gotten over myself. I'm not so freaked out, and I'm just enjoying the whole process. Here, I decided that I didn't like this area up top. I wanted to kind of close the piece off. I felt like it was just too white or something. It was bothering me. So I go ahead and add some darks up top. And I just wanted more focus on the face. So I wanted it to be a little bit darker up there. She just felt a little too kind of floaty. So that helped kind of ground her in the space. And then I decided, same thing at the bottom, I needed to kind of add a little bit more of that dark tone to balance it out. So I went ahead and did that. Some more drips, because why not? See, and once I start pushing the darks, I can really start going for it. So I'm pushing that neck in shadow much stronger. Knowing that, you know, most of these darks are going to dry, well, not most of them, everything dries lighter with watercolor as opposed to darker, which is typical of acrylic. So I knew that I had to push things a little bit more if I actually wanted it to make an impact. And I made a little mud there, but oh well. Another watercolor pencil, but this time in a kind of a orangey red, just to add in some more contrast and some interesting lines. So that is pretty dry now, and going in and just using my dryer a little bit more just to really make sure it's all dry. And I am taking here now a white pastel pencil. Nope, I decided I wanted to go with the white gouache. So the white pastel pencil wasn't doing it for me. So kind of some transparent white layers here just to establish that cheekbone. It kind of got lost in the mix. So there is the white gouache that you can bring in, and it works beautifully with the watercolor because it's water activated and it's soft. It's not quite as the way it dries it's quite beautiful with the way it integrates with the watercolor, as opposed to like a white titanium white acrylic, which might dry a little too opaque, a little too plasticky. But you know, you could definitely use the white acrylic if that's what you have. But I would go like maybe delicately with it, if that's the look you're going for, if you want it to be subtle. Adding a little bit more shadow across the brow there, where there tends to be just a subtle shadow. Starts to come out into space there, right underneath the brow. So these are, you know, again, just little moments of refinement, adding in a little bit of highlight on the brow bone, just trying to think about where the light would be catching without overdoing it too much. Yeah, and your paper towels are like your best friends when you are doing watercolor. I had the paper towels at the ready the entire time, so highly recommend having that ready to go. So I'm just softening some of the shadows with a little bit of the white gouache and a little bit of the blue, and it looks like a little bit of the red, so I'm getting more of that gray tone and just pushing the shadow underneath the lips a little bit. And you'll see once you push a shadow, it really changes the form. You start to feel the form more, which I just love that play of light and shadow. It's one of my favorite things about portraits is, you know, finding those beautiful layers and patterns of light and shadow and how things play off each other. So again, just making a little bit more definition around the face, wanting to really pull the face forward. So I'm adding that dark in there. And just going back in with a little bit more of the white. Just giving it a good thorough drying. A couple of last touches with the darker pencil. And this is where I have to really start to go, okay, am I done? I don't want to overwork it. I want to keep it fresh, so I'm trying to be mindful of that. It's so easy to push a piece, past its limit. And then one of my favorite parts, getting the tape off and seeing it without the tape. It always makes such a huge difference. It's so funny. So if your tape is like a little bit resistant, just heat it a little bit. That's a little trick I learned. And take that tape off and get to enjoy what you've created. I always love what a clean border can do for the piece. It's kind of interesting. And so there she is, my watercolor muse. So thank you guys so much for being here with me and watching this. I hope you enjoyed watching the process, and I hope you give it a go. It was really, really fun. And I loved creating this watercolor muse. And I can't wait to do more. Thanks so much for watching, guys.